Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We got an aquatic episode in store this week. Joe, what do you want to talk about?
Yeah, the temperature outside is starting to warm up a little bit, and we're starting to see some ponds show some signs of stratification. And along with that, oftentimes can come fish kills in the summer. And so I thought we'd talk a little bit about what stratification is in a pond and how that can lead to fish kills and what we can do to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Good thing to talk about for sure. So, just getting right to it, what is stratification in a pond? What's that mean?
I've been researching water for 20 years or so, showing my age a little bit, but it still baffles my mind that water at different temperatures won't mix. And so warm water and cold water are just like oil and vinegar. They don't mix together. And so a lot of people have probably experienced that. Maybe they don't know about it, but walking out into a pond or a lake somewhere and your feet get cold when you get a little deeper, and people often say, hey, I found a spring. Well, normally what you found is the thermocline, and so when you get down into deeper habitats, that water tends to be colder, and it also can't exchange oxygen with the surface like the top water can, and so it's colder, and it also doesn't have oxygen. So that colder water is deeper. The water on top tends to be warmer. We have things like wind and wave action that's mixing it up and adding oxygen to that top layer. So those two separate layers separating out would be stratification in a pond.
Okay. And is it normal to just have like a warm layer and a cold layer, or can you have multiple different layers out there, or what's that look like?
Yeah, so there's going to be two big layers. The deep layer is called the hypolimnion. If we think about hypothermia, that means below a temperature. So hypo would be deep. Limnion would be, the hypolimnion would be that deeper area then, right? And epilimnion, epi means top. So you'd have the epilimnion. Those two layers, the top layer and the bottom layer, tend to be the biggest. In the middle there's something called a thermocline or a metalimnion. And that's a really small area where the temperature fluctuates a lot. And it kind of is just like a separator between those two layers. That can change a lot. That can have a lot of really different layers that are changing by a tenth of a degree or something like that. But typically you're going to have that top layer and bottom layer, the two main layers that you're going to see in a pond.
Interesting. I know, like, I did some scuba diving classes when I was young, and we did the dive for getting certified in an old lead and zinc mine. It was super deep and it was super clear. Mm-hmm. And I remember getting down to the thermocline with a dive mask on and being able to see it, and you could physically see it. It looked like when you watch water boil in a clear pot, just those different layers, you could see them sitting there shimmering almost as you went down through them. They like got blurry, and then you'd get into even clearer water down below.
Yeah, without nerding out too much, though, the chemistry of the molecules, they move closer together or further apart. So you do see some of that. That'd be some of the clarity you're talking about. And then the way that the water can hold different molecules of suspended matter, for example, that can change. And so you can see, water quality differences in a lot of the parameters of the water quality itself. And so lots of different differences there, and being able to see that is really unique. Sometimes people have, if you leave a water bottle in your car, a cold water bottle on a hot day, you might take a sip or two and it'll be warm and then it can get cold. But if you look at it, you can see those different layers even in a bottle of water.
Yeah, very cool. It definitely nerdy stuff, but very, very, very cool. So how do fish kills happen in association with that, the stratification of the water?
Sure.
Why does that all work together?
Yeah, so these layers can have really big differences in temperature, right? And so it can be, up to 30 degrees Fahrenheit differences between the top layer, the epilimnion, and the deeper layer, the hypolimnion. And so what happens is that top layer can exchange oxygen with the environment. We talked about wave action, for example, adding some of that oxygen into the water. So the top area can always add in oxygen. So things like fish breathing or plants transpiring, using up some of that oxygen isn't really that big of a deal in that top layer. because we can get more oxygen from the surface. When you're down deeper, things like bacteria are living down there, and they're gobbling up nutrients that are down there, and they're using up oxygen. And there's no way to really replenish the amount of oxygen that we need to. That deep layer, the hypolimnion, starts to become anoxic. So there's no oxygen down there, and then you have an event where those two layers mix. And when those layers mix, instead of having an oxygen-rich area at the top where everything can survive, you end up having just a little bit of oxygen everywhere in the pond, and it's not enough, to support fish life. So that transition, that flipping turnover event would be something that lowers the oxygen levels enough that the fish would die.
Interesting. So, in the absence of a turnover event, in most ponds, how deep would that hypolimnion be?
Yeah.
Like, how much of the pond volume would be the oxygen-rich water, and how much would be the cold anoxic water?
Yeah, and that's going to change throughout the season. So when you're starting out, they're going to be relatively equal. As a baseline, kind of a rule of thumb, you're going to be looking at about 6 feet deep or so, somewhere in that range. It's going to depend on the depth of the pond, the water clarity, lots of different issues. But as the summer goes on, that bottom layer, that hypolimnion, is going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's going to rise up towards the surface. It might be 4 feet, 3 feet, 2 feet. And as that gets shallower, that increases the likelihood of something like a thunderstorm with big raindrops or hail breaking through those top layers, having enough force to break through that thermocline and mix everything up. So the depth is going to vary. It's going to start out kind of deeper at that 6 foot range, but it can get up. It's going to change throughout the day as the water temperatures change. That thermocline can move up and down in a pond. So lots going on that we're not thinking about necessarily when we go swimming, but lots of cool stuff going on there in the background.
Yeah, very cool. So you mentioned that a big thermostorm, a big thunderstorm with hail and rain and that sort of stuff can mix it up. What else can cause that turnover event?
Yeah, that turnover event can happen naturally. And so if we see changes in the weather, for example, so in the fall time frame, we see a lot of turnover events naturally happen. So ponds, you might walk out and they might look brown all of a sudden. And a lot of times that's because that whole pond is mixing and the force of the water moving is pulling up some sediment from the bottom. And so that is a big common thing. Heavy winds coming through can push enough to break up those different thermoclines. So most of it's related to temperature or to wind or to wave action.
Interesting. Does pond size affect how vulnerable it might be to a turnover event like that?
Yeah, so really, really small ponds, we're thinking about like backyard ponds, they're unlikely to stratify. Things that are under 4 feet deep, there tends to be enough action to just kind of keep everything mixed up, right? And so we're thinking about smaller ponds or shallow ponds, probably not going to see stratification as much. When you start to get to 1 to 2 acre ponds that are in that 8, 10, 12-foot range, that's where it's really common to see it. You can see, you'll see thermoclines in really big areas. So reservoirs that have, cover hundreds of acres can have a thermocline. So I remember growing up, I would drive around with my depth finder in my boat and find the deepest area of a reservoir because I swore that's, big fish have to be in deep areas.
Yeah.
So in my little brain, that made sense at the time. And I spent countless hours fishing for trophy catfish out in these reservoirs in Ohio. And then I remember being in college, realizing how much time I'd wasted when I was a youngster out there, because there's no oxygen in those deep habitats. So size of the pond, the turnover events are going to be more likely to happen in 1, 2, 3 acre ponds. So generally a little bit smaller, but they can happen. You can see it happen in a lake. You can see it happen pretty much anywhere that there's water.
Cool. So when we have a summer fish kill because of these turnover events, are there particular fish vulnerable, or is how would you know that was the cause of your fish kill if you went out there and looked?
So bigger fish need more oxygen. Their metabolic demand is higher, and so what you're going to see, some of the signs that you need to be worried would be if you walk out and you see a bunch of fish at the top trying to gulp air, right? And so fish have this ability, they can actually swallow air into their swim bladder. And when they do that, they can absorb some oxygen in that manner. So when oxygen levels start to get low in the water, they don't get enough from their gills, they might start gasping at the surface. Some fish have to do that to survive. And so I think we've talked about gar around here in Kansas are really common. Gar are obligate air breathers. When it's warmer and the water's holding less oxygen, they have to gulp air from the surface or they won't have enough oxygen to survive. And so you'll see them breaking the water a lot if you're out on a river. A lot of times people think it's a big bass or something. You play games in your mind. Whatever you're fishing for is jumping out of the water,
sure,
catching something to eat. And that does happen occasionally too. But a lot of times when you're out, these fish are just trying to gulp a little air. Might be trying to grab a bug too off the surface. So, but generally bigger fish are going to have more metabolic demands. So we're going to see them gulping air or dying first. And then we're going to follow that up with smaller fish. And so you start to see large numbers of small fish, show up dead, start floating. That'd be a pretty good indication. Most of the time, this is going to all happen overnight, right? So you're going to come out in the early hours, and you're going to see your surface of your pond covered in dead fish. Really, really a sad sight to see. And so hopefully we can take some steps to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no kidding. Is there any difference in vulnerability of different species? I mean, like are catfish less vulnerable or are bluegill more vulnerable than bass or something like that?
Yeah, so different fish are capable of one, they have different oxygen demands, and then they're capable of surviving in different oxygen levels. Bass tend to be a little bit more susceptible, and catfish tend to be a little more hardy. Bream, bluegill, sunfish are kind of somewhere in the middle. You're going to lose some of them, but they tend to tolerate things a little bit more. So, what you would generally see first are your big bass would probably start to die, and then you'd start to see smaller bass and sunfish in a pond, and then follow that up, you'd probably see your catfish last. So that'd probably be in a typical pond setting, that's kind of what you would experience.
That makes sense. I know bullheads can live just about anywhere. If I had a pond and I went out there and there were bullheads floating, I'd think the world probably ended.
Well, that's fair. Bullheads are pretty good they can survive in just about anything. So if you see all your bullheads going belly up, you might want to get away from that water.
Yeah, hopefully we don't have a bunch of bullheads in our pond in the first place, but if we do. So are summer fish kills and later season fish kills like we might have in the fall, are they the same? Are they different? Or what are we seeing there?
Yeah, so summer fish kills are just the oxygenated area, the epilimnion, and the unoxygenated area, the hypolimnion mixing all together, right? And so that mixing is generally why we see fish die in the summer. We'll see that in the fall too. So naturally, when temperatures start to change, the ponds can turn over naturally. One of the big differences between the summer and the fall is that colder water holds more oxygen. So as we start to get into the fall, that water's cooling off and there's more oxygen available in the water that's there. And so that's why we can have natural turnover events and it doesn't always kill the fish every year, right?
Interesting.
Because it's colder. The other type of fish kill that we see often is winter fish kills. And we talked about that a few months ago in an episode talking about, what can happen there. The big thing with the winter fish kills is you have ice on the surface of a pond. There's lots of little tiny algae that are growing throughout that pond water even when it's cold. And if we then get a layer of snow on top of that ice, it blocks out the sunlight from coming into our pond. When that happens, all those algae die and then bacteria eat them up. And that process of all that bacterial activity uses up the oxygen in the pond because there's ice there's no ability for it to replenish the oxygen, and so you can see fish die. So during the summer and the fall, those fish kills have a similar mechanism, and then the winter fish kills would be a different mechanism.
Interesting. All related to oxygen, but due to different reasons.
Yep.
So how do we try and prevent this from happening during the warmer months of the year? We can't go out there with a push broom and sweep the snow off if there's no snow on the ice.
One of the important things we can do is monitor our plant populations. And so plants are very good during the day. They're giving off oxygen during photosynthesis. But at night, when the sun goes down, they transpire, and transpiration uses oxygen out of the water. So if we look at oxygen levels throughout the day, it's going to rise up throughout the day while the plants are giving off oxygen, and then overnight it's going to drop off. And so that can make a really dynamic system where we have really high levels during the day and really low levels at night. And if we mitigate the number of plants that we have in our pond, make sure that they're giving off enough during the day but not using up as much at night, that can help with that oxygen demand in the pond. So kind of regulating the right amount of plants that we have is one good place to start. One thing that is commonly done is regulating the amount of nutrients that are entering the pond, and that ties back into those different plants. And so the nutrients, that cycling is really important. A lot of people put in aeration too, and aeration can be helpful. Lots of different types of aeration. You'd want to make sure you have the right type of aeration, but again, something that you could do to help reduce the risk of a turnover.
So if I'm going to aerate my pond, do I want to just put like a floating sprinkler out there so it's just disturbing the top layer, or do I want to put a bubbler at the bottom like I might have in an aquarium, or how do we do that?
A lot of people want to go out and get a cheap system that throws water in the air. So fountains are really pretty and they're really good at moving water from the surface. The unfortunate things about that is that top layer where they're moving water from, we've talked about, already has oxygen, right? And so fountains generally in deeper systems aren't going to help our aeration at all because the top layer already has oxygen in it. It's already exchanging it. So what we want to do is we want to have something called a benthic diffusion system, and those are bubblers that's put on the bottom of the pond. There's a small horsepower motor that is pumping water out to those diffusers, and they're bubbling up to the surface. Really what they're doing is they're just kind of helping to keep the entire pond mixed up so we don't have that stratification where the top layer and the bottom layer separate out.
What if I wanted to be cheap and I use the fountain, but instead of having the pump for the fountain on the top of the pond, what if I put the pump down at the bottom?
Yeah, and they make those systems, and that's something that can be done. You're oxygenating that water that you're pulling out, but really what we're trying to do is push that water from the bottom up to the top. And so all of the water that's pulled in by that fountain and thrown in the air is going to get oxygenated, but we're not going to have that benefit of pushing all of the water up and keeping that circular motion where we're oxygenating everything in the water. So it can tend to work. Those types of systems can work in really small ponds, confined areas. When you get to bigger systems, it's really important that you're letting that air push the water up and keep everything moving around.
Cool. I know we've got one of those benthic diffuser systems in a state lake here close to Manhattan. I think Pot 1 maybe.
Yep, Pot 1 has them out there, and they're really good systems. They can do a lot of good. The installation cost is pretty much the limiting factor, and so for a 1 acre pond, a lot of times you're looking at $5,000 to $10,000 with install, and so quite an investment in a smaller pond, but it can make a lot of benefit there.
Yeah, well, I guess if we're thinking about $50,000-$60,000 for a new pond construction cost, that might be overshooting a little bit, but a $5,000 or $10,000 aerator might be a good investment.
I don't think you're overshooting. If you can get a new pond built for $50,000, you're probably good these days. The price to get one constructed, it's crazy what some people spend on them.
When I was a sophomore in high school, I might have been a freshman, but we built a 1 acre pond on our property, and I remember Dad showed me the bill. It was $1,500 worth of dozer work to build that 1 acre pond.
Well, I imagine you'd get some callers that would be happy to pay $1,500 for a new pond. So
we're getting sidetracked a little bit with my little mind. If we're thinking about aerating the pond, do we need to think about timing? Is there a temperature when we need to quit? Do we need to worry about whether it's on at night, during the daytime, all those sorts of things?
Yeah, and so temperature, when the water starts to get around 50 or 55 degrees Fahrenheit is when you'd want to turn it on, and then you'd want to turn it off in the winter. Some people want to keep it running through the winter, and that may be okay in certain situations. If you want to keep the water open for ducks, for example, it can help with that. It's really hard on the system, so you're going to have to replace your pump more often. And then the other thing is, if you keep the water mixed up too much, the water can supercool. So the water can actually get to a temperature below freezing, and it can freeze the fish that are swimming around in there. And so it's not a good thing. It can cause a lot of damage. And so the time of year, I recommend that we turn them off in the winter. They're not really helping us a lot in the winter months. You mentioned time of day, and one of the things that comes up often is how to power these systems. And so a big part of that install cost I mentioned is running electricity to the box that's generally on the shoreline that's going to be pumping that air. Ponds aren't always built right next to a power unit, and so that can be quite an expense to get it out pretty far. And so people ask if they can use solar or wind power. And the answer is yes, but with a caveat. And so if we think about, we talked earlier about when we need oxygen most in a pond, and we need it right before the sun comes up, right, or overnight. That's when the levels get lowest. So thinking about solar, when the sun's down, we're not going to be getting much energy. And so we have to have the right number of battery banks to make sure that system is running well. And that gets to be expensive, right? And so the other thing is with wind, when you need the aeration most is generally on calmer days. And so we're not going to have power on calmer days when we need that aeration most. So solar sometimes can work. Wind generally does not work. And in general, my recommendation is if you can get power there, get power there.
Got it. When you go to turn this thing on in the springtime, as that water starts to warm up, do we just turn it on and let it go, or do we need to start it gradually, or what's that look like?
Yeah, turning them on, we don't know if that water's already stratified. So if you go out and you just flip the switch on and walk away, you're running the risk of causing a turnover event like we talked about and having a fish kill. And so when you turn them on or you turn on a new system for the first time, you want to turn them on for 15 minutes and turn it off for the day. The next day you turn it on for 30 minutes and turn it off for the day. And you keep doubling that every day. It takes about a week to 10 days before you're up to 24 hours, and you just leave it on running after that. Once you have aeration, it's very important that you run that aeration system all the time. Water can stratify, and you can get oxygenated and unoxygenated water really quickly. And so if we turn our system off or our system runs out of power because it's solar or wind operated, you can see stratification happen really quickly. So it's actually more risky to run an aeration system poorly than it is to have no aeration at all.
Interesting. Well, so these aerators can help us with, issues associated with stratification and fish kills. Is there anything else that they can help us with?
Yeah, one of the other benefits in keeping everything oxygenated, there are a lot of bacteria that are at the bottom of a pond. And when they have oxygen, they can use up nutrients that are in that water column. And so we see them using nitrogen and phosphorus are the main ones. Phosphorus tends to bind to sediment when it's washed into a pond system, and so it tends to be down in that benthos layer. Nitrogen can be exchanged from the atmosphere, so it's generally more spread out. But the bacteria can be more active, can be really beneficial. They actually sell bacteria pellets that you can throw in your pond, and people try that all the time. They've been shown to work really well in laboratory settings. We haven't been able to replicate that in a lake, and likely because those bacteria are already there, right? What they're generally lacking is that oxygen. So bacteria are really beneficial. That nutrient cycling helping to keep down the amount of nutrients that are out there, right? And if we can regulate those nutrients, we can regulate things like plant growth that are in our pond or cyanobacterial blooms. We can make sure that there's not too many nutrients available for them.
And what's that?
Cyanobacteria.
Yeah, what's that mean?
Fancy word. So blue-green algae is probably what we know it as, right? And so they like to grow on the surface, and they can be toxic. And so making sure that we're cutting down the risk for those blue-green algae, that's especially important in ponds that are being used for livestock or recreation. So seen a few dogs that have gotten sick. People are throwing a ball or a frisbee in water where that blue-green algae is present. We talked about that in a previous episode too, right? So if you're interested in that, go check it out. But lots of benefits to the water quality. It stabilizes having oxygen everywhere, keeping everything mixed up, really stabilizes a lot of the water quality, makes everything happy and healthy. So lots of advantages to that aeration system.
What about mosquitoes? Do they help with mosquitoes at all?
Ironically, they do. And
Huh.
so it's not something people regularly think of unless they have a small backyard pond. And so mosquito larvae grow up in water, and they need stagnant water. And so they don't really like it when the water moves. It disrupts their life cycle. So if we keep that water moving enough, we can cut down on the amount of mosquito larvae that are growing up to adults. So having aeration most definitely can help cut down on the number of mosquitoes or other aquatic invertebrates that then have terrestrial forms that might bug us. So something that we can use, especially for backyard ponds, small backyard ponds, having aeration would be key to keeping down those mosquitoes.
Interesting. So kind of like putting Plains killifish or top minnows out there.
Yeah, or Gambusia affinis. I mean, mosquito fish are common to be used out there for keeping down some of those mosquitoes. So I know I've talked about this before too, but I remember being mesmerized by bugs in a puddle, right? And so thinking about invertebrates that are in the water column that then have a terrestrial form, it's really interesting and intriguing, and especially if we can cut down on the number of mosquitoes that are flying around at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. All right, thanks, Joe, for bringing this topic, thinking about stratification and fish kills and all that kind of stuff during the middle of summer. It's a great time, I'm sure, to be talking about this. I imagine you get lots of phone calls about it this time of year. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks with a terrestrial topic.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.